There is something endlessly fascinating about fortunes that rise like mountains and then vanish like smoke. We are drawn to stories of immense wealth, sprawling estates, glittering jewels, and families who seemed untouchable. These are the tales of dynasties that ruled not only with money but with power, influence, and legacy. They appeared to be built for eternity, the kind of wealth that would pass unbroken through countless generations. And yet, history whispers a different truth. Behind the polished portraits, the grand palaces, and the endless banquets, there were cracks, and those cracks grew until entire empires of wealth collapsed into ruin. Imagine a palace with chandeliers glittering above ballrooms filled with silks and laughter, while beyond the gilded walls debts piled higher than the towers. Picture a family whose name commanded respect in every corner of Europe, yet within a few decades their heirs were penniless wanderers, clinging only to memories of past grandeur. These are not rare stories. They repeat across centuries, across continents, each one both unique and strangely familiar. We marvel at how such vast riches could be squandered or destroyed. How could centuries of wealth be undone in a single generation? How could families that once commanded armies and shaped politics end up in exile or obscurity? The answers are not simple. Sometimes it was greed, gambling, or reckless spending. Other times it was war, revolution, or the unstoppable tide of change. Often it was a mixture of both, the failings within and the storms without. Something is haunting about these tales, because they do not belong only to the past. They are mirrors of our own time. The names and faces may be different, but the temptations are the same. Arrogance, excess, short-sightedness. These can topple a modern fortune as surely as they toppled the aristocrats of Versailles or the tycoons of the Gilded Age. What feels eternal is often fragile. What seems secure can vanish overnight. Yet within these downfalls there are also stories of resilience. Stripped of power, some heirs reinvented themselves, working ordinary jobs or turning ruined estates into new opportunities. Others clung to titles and memories, unable to accept the loss. The contrast between despair and adaptation, decline and reinvention, makes these stories not only tragic but deeply human. Over the course of this journey, we will uncover how empires of wealth were built, how they crumbled, and what remains when the last jewels are sold and the last estates abandoned. You will see how vices, wars, revolutions, and time itself shaped destinies that once seemed unshakable. These are stories of grandeur and downfall, of pride and humility, of vanished riches that still echo through history. Welcome to our channel, Words of Time, and in this video we begin our exploration into the shocking downfalls of the world's greatest fortunes. If you enjoy uncovering hidden truths from history and tracing the dramatic rise and fall of dynasties, you are in the right place. We often look at immense fortunes and imagine them as immovable, as if wealth on that scale is permanent. When a family, a dynasty, or a business empire has been standing for generations, it seems unthinkable that it could vanish. Yet history tells a different story. The truth is that even the most secure fortunes can collapse, sometimes overnight, sometimes over decades of slow decline. What seems indestructible in one century can be a ruin in the next. The fall of great fortunes has as much drama as any novel, and the lessons they leave behind are as sharp today as they were when the ruins were first formed. The story of vanished riches is not only about money, but also about pride, ambition, greed, and miscalculation. These fortunes were not just piles of gold or stocks in a company. They represented entire ways of life, networks of power, and in many cases, the future of entire regions. When they fell, they left not only families in disgrace, but also workers without jobs, cities without patrons, and sometimes nations scrambling to recover from the void. To understand the fragility of wealth is to understand something fundamental about human society. The most famous example of a sudden downfall is the story of the Medici family of Florence. For hundreds of years, they seemed untouchable. They had wealth from banking, influence over the Catholic Church, and control over Florentine politics. They built some of the world's greatest art collections, funded architects and thinkers, and gave us monuments that still stand today. Yet their banking empire crumbled because of risky loans and the reckless spending of later heirs. The same family that once produced popes and queens of France ended with dukes whose coffers were nearly empty and whose influence had evaporated. The story shows that one wrong move, whether in banking policy or in personal judgment, can turn centuries of fortune into nothing. Another dramatic case comes from the story of the Russian aristocracy. Before the Russian Revolution, Noble families owned vast estates that stretched as far as the eye could see. They had serfs, palaces in the cities, and connections that seemed eternal. Yet within a few short years of revolution, their riches were confiscated, their homes seized, and many of them forced into exile with nothing but the clothes they could carry. What looked like permanent, unshakable wealth proved fragile once the winds of politics shifted. Families who once lived with hundreds of servants found themselves selling jewelry in Paris just to buy food. The Vanderbilt family in the United States provides another example of fortune's fragility. Cornelius Vanderbilt built a fortune in shipping and railroads in the 19th century that was one of the largest the world had ever seen. His descendants built mansions so vast and extravagant that they became symbols of the so-called Gilded Age. But within a few generations, the fortune was splintered. Poor financial management, reckless spending, and the division of wealth among too many heirs meant that by the mid-20th century, many Vanderbilts were living without any sign of the family's past glory. Some worked regular jobs and had little more than average incomes. This collapse happened not because of revolutions or war, but because of careless spending and a belief that the fortune would last forever without active protection. One of the most shocking modern downfalls came with the fall of the Enron Corporation in the early 2000 years. At its peak, Enron was one of the most admired companies in the United States, valued at tens of billions. It was celebrated for its innovation and for changing the way the energy market worked. Yet behind the success was a web of lies, accounting tricks, and fraudulent schemes. When the truth came out, the company imploded almost instantly. Thousands of employees lost their jobs and their retirement savings. The executives faced trials, prison, and in some cases personal ruin. Investors who once thought they were backing one of the safest bets in the economy lost everything. What seemed unbreakable turned out to be built on illusion. The Romanov dynasty is another reminder of how fragile wealth tied to power can be. For centuries, the Romanovs ruled Russia with immense authority and wealth. They lived in palaces glittering with gold, dined from silver, and owned jewels that dazzled the world. But their attachment to outdated political systems, combined with disastrous decisions during World War I, left them vulnerable. In 1917, the monarchy collapsed. Within a year, the royal family was executed, their palaces stripped, and their treasures seized or scattered. The richest family in Russia ended with no wealth, no throne, and no future. The British aristocracy also suffered losses, though in a slower and quieter way. Many noble families held great estates for centuries, passing them down through generations. Yet the rise of industrialization, new taxes, and the decline of agricultural profits chipped away at their wealth. By the mid-20th century, some families could not afford to maintain their massive homes. Many sold them to the state, turned them into museums, or simply abandoned them. What looked like permanent dynasties became financially unsustainable. In South America, there is the story of the rubber barons of the Amazon in the late 19th century. They built fortunes from the booming demand for rubber, constructing mansions in the jungle and living with all the luxuries of Europe. Manaus, in Brazil, even had an opera house where European singers performed, funded by rubber money. But when rubber plants were smuggled out and cultivated in Asia, the Amazon monopoly collapsed. Within a few years, the rubber fortunes vanished. Palaces that once echoed with music were left to decay, and families that had seemed unstoppable were ruined. The story of the Irish landowners after the Great Famine in the 19th century is also a powerful reminder. Many had been wealthy on paper, owning large estates, but their wealth depended on tenant farmers paying rents. When famine struck, tenants could not pay, and the landlords themselves became unable to maintain their properties. Debts mounted, and many estates were sold off. Families who had ruled the countryside for generations were forced to leave or shrink into obscurity. These examples show a common thread. Wealth, no matter how vast, is never safe without careful stewardship, adaptability, and sometimes sheer luck. Fortunes tied too tightly to one industry or one political system can collapse when conditions change. Wealth spread across too many heirs without discipline often splinters. Arrogance can blind even the most intelligent heirs into thinking their position is secure. There is also the human tendency to believe that tomorrow will always look like today. The Medici believed their banking system would always hold. The Russian aristocracy thought the old social order would last. The Vanderbilts assumed their fortune was too large to ever run out. The Enron executives believed their tricks would never be discovered. Yet history shows again and again that tomorrow is not guaranteed. We can see in these stories both a warning and a lesson. The warning is clear: no fortune is beyond collapse. The lesson is that stewardship, humility, and foresight are as important as wealth itself. It is not only about gaining riches, but also about protecting them and adapting to change. Those who ignore this truth risk watching everything vanish, often in ways that seem shocking to later generations. The drama of vanished riches also explains why we remain fascinated with these stories. There is something magnetic about the fall of the mighty. We are drawn to the spectacle of palaces turned into ruins, mansions left abandoned, and heirs struggling to hold on to scraps of what once seemed infinite. It reminds us of the fragility of life itself and the fact that no amount of gold, land, or stock can make anyone immune to time and change. As we reflect on these tales, it becomes clear that vanished fortunes are not just about money. They are about human decisions, human flaws, and the unpredictable forces of history. In the end, wealth is only as secure as the wisdom and humility of those who hold it. That is the unexpected truth behind seemingly unbreakable fortunes. Gambling, greed, and grandeur were often the hidden engines that drove once mighty families toward collapse. When we think of the downfalls of aristocratic dynasties, it is easy to blame wars, revolutions, or shifting economies. But in many cases, the rot came from within. The glittering halls of wealth often concealed habits of recklessness, indulgence, and arrogance. Generations who inherited great fortunes sometimes lacked the discipline of those who built them. Instead of prudence, they turned to extravagance. Instead of stewardship, they gave in to whims. What followed was not simply loss, but humiliation, a slow-motion undoing caused by their own hands. Among the clearest examples of self-inflicted ruin is the story of the French aristocracy leading up to the Revolution. Families like the Bourbons, who had ruled France for centuries, lived with such extravagance that their grandeur blinded them to reality. At Versailles, parties, jewels, fountains, and banquets consumed resources beyond imagination. Gambling was not merely a pastime, but a way of life. Noblemen lost vast sums at card tables, and noblewomen wagered fortunes on games played late into the night. Entire estates changed hands because of a single evening's recklessness. When debts mounted, they were often paid by squeezing peasants harder, creating resentment that would soon boil over. While the revolution was a complex event with many causes, it is hard to ignore the role that greed and indulgence played in weakening the nobility's ability to withstand crisis. Another telling case comes from England, where the Cavendish family, the Dukes of Devonshire, built one of the grandest estates in Europe at Chatsworth House. Their wealth was immense, drawn from land, coal, and influence at court. Yet by the 18th and 19th centuries, gambling and lavish living had eroded much of their security. William Cavendish, the fifth Duke, was notorious for his obsession with cards and dice. His wife, Georgiana, the Duchess of Devonshire, was equally infamous for her gambling debts, which often reached staggering sums. So great were her losses that she borrowed secretly, begged friends for loans, and sometimes pawned her own jewels to cover them. The splendor of Chatsworth masked a reality of financial strain. Though the family eventually recovered in later generations, the near ruin caused by gambling was a reminder that even the most powerful houses could tremble under the weight of personal vices. In Austria, the Habsburg dynasty offers a broader but equally instructive picture. For centuries, the Habsburgs controlled vast territories, from Spain to Central Europe, yet they repeatedly spent beyond their means. Court life in Vienna was drenched in pageantry and ritual. Emperors hosted endless ceremonies, balls, and entertainments, each designed to display power, but each draining the treasury. Members of the family were also prone to personal extravagance, building palaces and commissioning art without restraint. The result was that, time after time, the empire relied on borrowing to sustain appearances. By the 18th century, the state was burdened with debts so large that wars became harder to finance and reforms nearly impossible to implement. While external enemies challenged the empire, it was internal indulgence that hollowed out its foundations. The Spanish nobility during the golden age of the 16th and 17th centuries also lived in a haze of grandeur that masked financial ruin. Spain controlled territories across the world, from the Americas to Asia, and silver poured into the royal treasury from mines in Mexico and Peru. Yet rather than using this wealth to build sustainable prosperity, the aristocracy and monarchy indulged in endless wars, displays of pomp, and reckless speculation. Noble families built palaces, supported vast households of servants, and funded elaborate religious foundations, often spending far more than their incomes could sustain. The easy flow of silver created an illusion of limitless wealth, but inflation ate away at its value, and debts mounted. Within a few generations, many noble houses that had been among the richest in Europe were weighed down with obligations they could never repay. Crossing to the Americas, the story of the Southern plantation families in the United States before the Civil War reveals similar patterns. Many of these families lived in mansions with white columns and rolling fields, presenting themselves as aristocrats of a new world. Their wealth came from enslaved labor and cash crops like cotton and tobacco. But behind the image of grandeur was financial fragility. Planters often lived beyond their means, borrowing heavily to maintain lifestyles of refinement and display. They imported expensive European furniture, traveled abroad, and gambled at horse races and gaming tables. When the Civil War destroyed the system of slavery, their wealth evaporated almost instantly. Yet even before the war, many were already teetering on the edge of debt, victims of their own indulgence and their refusal to adapt to a changing economy. Gambling was not only a noble vice, but also a corporate one. In the 20th century, the downfall of the Lehman Brothers Investment Bank can be understood in similar terms. Founded in the 19th century by German immigrants, the firm grew into one of the pillars of American finance. For decades it thrived, adapting to changing times and building immense prestige. But in the early years of the 21st century, its leaders gave in to a different form of gambling, reckless speculation in mortgage-backed securities. The hunger for profits blinded them to risk. Each bet was larger than the last, and when the housing market collapsed, the firm was unable to cover its losses. In 2008, Lehman Brothers declared bankruptcy, sending shockwaves through the global economy. The grandeur of its skyscraper offices and history of success could not protect it from the consequences of greed. Returning to the world of aristocratic families, one of the most poignant tales of self-destruction is that of the Roman Colonna family in Italy. The Colonnas were among the oldest and most powerful noble houses in Rome, with roots stretching back to the Middle Ages. They produced cardinals, generals, and patrons of the arts. But like their rivals, the Orsini, they were plagued by factional disputes, vanity, and extravagance. Time and again, they poured fortunes into building palaces and hosting feasts that outshone their rivals. They also spent heavily on private armies to fight feuds that often left both sides weakened. Though the Colonna name endures to this day, the grandeur of their earlier centuries was severely diminished by their own inability to restrain pride and spending. The lesson of these families is that gambling and greed were not isolated behaviors, but woven into the very culture of aristocracy. To gamble was to show bravado, to demonstrate that wealth was so abundant that it could be risked without fear. To live in grandeur was to display status, proving superiority over rivals. Yet these very habits planted seeds of ruin. For every family that managed to recover, like the Devonshires, there were others who never regained their footing. Estates were sold, titles faded into obscurity, and heirs found themselves reduced to poverty. What makes these stories even more tragic is the blindness that often accompanied decline. Many heirs believed that fortune was a birthright, something that could never truly disappear. They assumed that lands would always yield rents, that mines would always produce, that servants would always be there to serve. Few could imagine a world where the foundation of their wealth might crumble. This arrogance made them vulnerable not only to external shocks like war or revolution, but also to the quiet, steady erosion caused by their own indulgence. In some cases, the downfall was almost theatrical. Imagine a grand ballroom lit by hundreds of candles, a nobleman at the card table, his estate on the line. Guests watch as he lays down his hand and loses everything in a single moment. The next day, creditors arrive, lands are seized, and servants dismissed. Such scenes were not uncommon in 18th century Europe. Behind the glitter, fortunes disappeared with startling speed. But decline could also be slow, like a leaking roof that worsens each year until the house collapses. Families burdened with debts passed them down to their heirs, who added more debts of their own. Each generation hoped that some stroke of luck, some advantageous marriage, or some unexpected inheritance would rescue them. Sometimes it did, but more often the cycle of extravagance and mismanagement continued until nothing was left. When looking at these tales of ruin, one sees the same human tendencies repeated across centuries and continents. The specifics differ: the cards at Versailles, the horse races in Virginia, the stock exchanges in New York, but the underlying forces are the same: pride, recklessness, and the belief that wealth is indestructible. Grandeur provided temporary glory, but it often left behind empty halls, broken families, and the bitter taste of squandered possibility. These stories are not merely curiosities of history. They are reminders of the fragile nature of wealth itself. Just as families once fell because of gambling debts or the cost of endless banquets, modern fortunes can disappear through speculation, greed, and overconfidence. The forms change, but the human flaws remain the same. To study the self-inflicted wounds of the past is to see warnings for the present, where the seeds of ruin can still be found wherever extravagance outpaces wisdom. While gambling, greed, and grandeur so often sowed the seeds of ruin from within, history also shows that entire dynasties and fortunes were destroyed by forces far larger than themselves. However reckless an heir might have been, there were times when the tide of history swept away wealth that had been carefully stewarded for centuries. Revolutions, wars, and the violent reshaping of nations could undo families in a matter of months. In such moments, personal caution and discipline were often irrelevant. The palace doors, no matter how thick, could not withstand the thunder of upheaval. The Russian Revolution remains one of the most powerful examples of how quickly external shocks can annihilate centuries of accumulated riches. The aristocracy in Russia had been among the wealthiest in Europe, with vast estates, opulent palaces in St. Petersburg, and connections to the imperial court. Families like the Yusupovs, the Sheremetovs, and the Romanovs themselves lived lives so extravagant that they seemed untouchable. Yet when the revolution erupted in 1917, their entire way of life ended almost overnight. The Bolsheviks seized estates, nationalized properties, and stripped the nobility of their rights. Some families fled with jewels sewn into their clothes, while others were imprisoned or executed. The Yusupovs, once perhaps the richest family in Russia, lost palaces filled with treasures, tapestries, and masterpieces of art. Their name endured, but their fortune did not. The Romanovs, rulers for more than 300 years, were reduced to prisoners and then to corpses in a basement in Ekaterinburg. Their downfall was not caused by gambling debts or personal excess, but by the unstoppable force of revolution, which erased the old order entirely. The world wars, too, reshaped wealth in devastating ways. In the aftermath of World War I, ancient empires collapsed. The Habsburgs in Austria, who had ruled Central Europe for centuries, lost not only their crown but much of their fortune. Properties were confiscated, lands were broken up, and titles became meaningless in a new republican order. Members of the family who had once dined in glittering halls now scrambled to sell heirlooms to survive. Similarly, the Hohenzollerns of Germany saw their empire crumble. Wilhelm II fled into exile in the Netherlands, stripped of power. Palaces and estates were seized by the new government, and the grandeur of the Prussian monarchy evaporated. These were families who had ruled continents, yet they could not survive the storm of war and revolution that remade Europe in the early 20th century. World War II was no less destructive. Noble families across Europe saw their estates occupied, their treasures looted, and their homes bombed into rubble. In Poland, aristocratic families such as the Czartoryskis lost libraries, artworks, and lands that had been cultivated for generations. The Nazis confiscated their properties, and after the war, the communist regime kept them from reclaiming what was left. In France, the Rothschilds, one of the greatest banking families of the 19th century, saw their assets seized by the Vichy government and the Nazis. While they survived and eventually rebuilt, the disruption was massive, and many branches of the family never fully recovered. In Hungary, noble families that had stood for centuries lost everything when the Soviet Union imposed communism, reducing counts and princes to exiles or ordinary workers. One of the most tragic stories comes from the family of Tsar Nicholas II, whose end was both violent and symbolic. The Romanovs had lived in unimaginable luxury, their palaces filled with jewels, Fabergé eggs, and golden icons. Yet when the empire collapsed, their possessions could not shield them from fate. The entire immediate family was executed in secret, their bodies hidden for decades. The jewels sewn into the clothes of the Grand Duchesses did not buy them freedom, but only added to the grim cruelty of their deaths. The fall of the Romanovs was not simply the ruin of a family, but the destruction of an entire class of wealth and privilege. erased in the sweep of revolution. The impact of external shocks was not confined to Europe. In China, the fall of the Qing dynasty in the early 20th century marked the end of fortunes that had seemed eternal. For centuries, the imperial family and the aristocracy had controlled vast lands, palaces, and treasures of art. The Forbidden City itself was a monument to their wealth. Yet as the dynasty collapsed in 1911 and the Republic emerged, much of this wealth was seized, lost, or scattered. Puyi, the last emperor, went from the throne of China to a powerless puppet under Japanese control, and eventually to a humble life as a gardener after the Communist Revolution. His story embodies how quickly inherited grandeur could be reduced to obscurity when the political tides turned. The Middle East offers its own examples. The fall of monarchies in the 20th century often brought sudden ruin to ruling families. In Iran, the revolution of 1979 overthrew the Pahlavi dynasty. The Shah and his family, once among the wealthiest in the world, were forced into exile. Their palaces, jewels, and art collections were seized by the new regime. What had seemed like an unassailable fortune, supported by oil wealth and international alliances, collapsed in the face of revolutionary fervor. For the Pahlavi children, life shifted from opulent courts to the uncertain reality of exile. Even outside revolutions, wars alone could destroy fortunes. Consider the case of the great landed families of the American South during the Civil War. As described earlier, many were already fragile due to debt and extravagance. But the war itself was the final blow. Plantations were burned, slaves freed, and the entire economic structure upended. Families who had styled themselves as aristocrats of the New World lost nearly everything in a span of 4 years. The grandeur of their white-columned mansions could not survive cannon fire, nor could their wealth survive the abolition of slavery, which had been its foundation. Another striking case is the story of the Greek royal family during the turbulent 20th century. Though not as wealthy as some other European dynasties, they lived with the privileges of monarchy. But repeated political upheavals in Greece stripped them of both power and fortune. During the Second World War, they were forced into exile as Nazi troops occupied Athens. After the war, they returned, only to be deposed again in the 1960s and finally abolished as a monarchy in the 1970s. Estates were confiscated, palaces nationalized, and members of the family scattered across Europe, living not as royals but as displaced aristocrats. The broader pattern in these examples is that external forces often moved faster than families could react. A noble house might take decades to decline from gambling or mismanagement, but revolutions and wars could destroy everything in a matter of weeks. Estates that had been cultivated for generations vanished with the stroke of a decree. Palaces filled with treasures became government offices, museums, or ruins. The heirs, once secure in their titles, were left with nothing but memories and a family name that no longer commanded respect. One of the most haunting features of such downfalls is the scattering of treasures. When aristocratic fortunes collapsed due to war or revolution, artworks, jewels, and heirlooms often entered the global market. Faberge eggs from the Romanovs, paintings from French chateaux, manuscripts from Polish libraries, all found their way into museums or private collections. The wealth that had once been concentrated in the hands of a few families was dispersed across the world. While this preserved the objects, it meant that the original owners never saw them again. For descendants, visiting a museum often meant looking at what had once adorned their own family homes. It is tempting to think that families caught in the storm of history could have prepared better, but in truth, most could not. Few could have predicted the scale of destruction brought by the First World War, or the ferocity of revolutions in Russia and China, or the devastation of the Second World War. Wealth that seemed secure under the old order became meaningless when the order itself dissolved. Titles, lands, and even money in banks were vulnerable when regimes fell and borders shifted. What counted as riches in one generation could be worthless in the next, not because of mismanagement, but because of upheavals beyond human control. And yet, within these stories lies another lesson. Resilience sometimes allowed fragments of fortunes to survive. Some aristocrats fled early, carrying jewels or gold that allowed them to start again abroad. Others adapted, using education and connections to rebuild lives in exile. But even for those who managed to rebuild, the grandeur of the past was never fully restored. They might live comfortably, but the palaces, estates, and titles were gone forever. These stories of revolution, war, and ruin underline the precariousness of inherited wealth. Unlike fortunes built in commerce or industry, which could sometimes adapt to change, aristocratic wealth was often tied to land, titles, and systems of privilege that could vanish with a shift in power. The external forces that swept through the 19th and 20th centuries were relentless, and they made no exceptions for those who had once believed themselves untouchable. What emerges is a sobering truth. Wealth is never simply a matter of numbers in a ledger or jewels in a vault. It is tied to the structures of society, to governments, and to the stability of nations. When those structures collapse, fortunes can collapse with them. The families caught in history's crosshairs, whether the Romanovs in Russia, the Habsburgs in Austria, the Pahlavis in Iran, or the plantation families of the American South, show us that no amount of gold or grandeur can withstand the fury of revolution or the devastation of war. If war and revolution could strip away fortunes in an instant, what came after was often even more revealing. The collapse of wealth and power did not always end with execution or exile. Many families and individuals lived on after their downfall, navigating strange new worlds where their titles no longer carried weight and their grand homes belonged to someone else. Life after luxury was sometimes marked by quiet resilience, sometimes by despair, and often by a painful adjustment to realities that their ancestors would never have imagined. The image of an impoverished aristocrat is a haunting one. Once accustomed to ballrooms, servants, and silks, they often found themselves reduced to boarding houses, second-hand clothing, and ordinary labor. Some adapted with grace, learning trades or turning to the arts. Others fell into bitterness, unable to reconcile their past grandeur with their present obscurity. The legacy of luxury faded not only in wealth, but also in memory, as younger generations grew up far from the palaces and estates that had defined their name. A striking example is the life of Maria, the daughter of a Russian noble family whose estate was seized during the revolution. Her family fled with little more than a few jewels and a collection of letters. In Paris, Maria took work as a seamstress. The young woman who had once worn gowns imported from Milan now stitched dresses for the bourgeois families of her new city. Her hands, once praised for their delicate piano playing, became calloused with work. Yet she endured, raising children who knew nothing of the family's former estate or the gilded halls where their ancestors had danced. The resilience in such lives was not in preserving grandeur, but in finding dignity within ordinary struggles. In England, as the aristocracy slowly declined during the 19th and 20th centuries, many noble families faced similar adjustments. The weight of inheritance taxes, declining agricultural profits, and the cost of maintaining vast estates forced them to sell lands, homes, and treasures. Some families converted their great houses into museums, hotels, or schools. Visitors who paid a fee could wander through rooms once reserved for dukes and duchesses. For the heirs, this was both a humiliation and a necessity. Better to see Chatsworth or Blenheim filled with tourists than to watch them fall into ruin. Yet even this adaptation was not always enough. Many heirs were forced into ordinary professions, journalism, the military, or business. Titles remained, but their material reality was unrecognizable compared to the splendor of earlier centuries. The decline of the Vanderbilt family in America offers a vivid example of life after luxury. Within a few generations of Cornelius Vanderbilt amassing one of the greatest fortunes in American history, many descendants found themselves with little wealth left. The grand mansions of Fifth Avenue, once symbols of family pride, were demolished to make way for apartment buildings. Some Vanderbilts lived modestly, working regular jobs or fading into anonymity. One descendant became a struggling writer, another a minor television personality. The grandeur of railroads and shipping empires was reduced to fragments of memory, stories told at family gatherings rather than realities of daily life. Their adjustment to life after luxury was not marked by tragedy so much as by the quiet erosion of power into ordinariness. But not all impoverished aristocrats accepted their new circumstances with dignity. Some clung desperately to their titles and illusions of grandeur, even as their surroundings collapsed. In post-revolutionary Russia, many émigrés in Paris continued to address one another as princes, counts, and duchesses while living in cramped apartments and working as cab drivers or doormen. Their world had shrunk, but their pride refused to follow. In some cases, this pride sustained them, giving a sense of continuity in exile. In others, it bred bitterness, as the contrast between their titles and their reality grew too sharp to bear. The story of the Habsburgs after the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire illustrates both adaptation and decline. When the empire dissolved in 1918, the family lost crowns, lands, and palaces. Charles, the last emperor, went into exile with his family and died young, leaving his widow Zita with children to raise in poverty. They lived for years in small houses or borrowed lodgings, supported by sympathetic monarchists. Yet some Habsburg descendants eventually found ways to rebuild. Otto von Habsburg, son of Charles, became a respected European politician, advocating for integration and democracy. His life shows how aristocrats who had lost thrones could still carve out meaningful roles in new contexts, transforming legacy into service rather than luxury. The contrast between resilience and decline is also clear in the fate of Queen Marie Antoinette's surviving relatives after the French Revolution. Many who escaped the guillotine fled to other parts of Europe, where they lived on the charity of foreign courts. Some clung to hopes of restoration, others adapted quietly. Over time, however, most faded into obscurity. Titles like Comte or Duchesse meant little outside of France, and without estates or incomes, they were forced to live as ordinary émigrés. The children and grandchildren of this generation often married into middle-class families, slowly blending into the societies that had once regarded them with awe. In other cases, adaptation meant turning personal talents into survival. The Russian ballerinas who emerged from noble families after the revolution became symbols of this transformation. Girls who had trained in gilded studios found themselves performing in modest theaters across Europe, sending money home to parents living in exile. Their artistry became a form of resilience, a way to preserve dignity while also confronting reality. The legacy of wealth was gone, but the legacy of culture endured. One poignant story is that of Prince Felix Yusupov, who was involved in the assassination of Rasputin. His family had been the richest in Russia, owners of treasures and palaces that rivaled the Romanovs. After the revolution, he fled with his wife to Paris. They lived by selling jewels and later by producing perfumes and fashion accessories. Felix, once a man of extraordinary wealth and influence, became a businessman catering to a society that was more interested in survival than grandeur. Though he preserved a trace of luxury in exile, his life was a pale shadow of what it had once been. Yet he endured, adapting with wit and resourcefulness, a reminder that survival itself can be a kind of legacy. The same theme echoes in countless other stories. In Poland, the noble families who survived the devastations of World War too often found themselves living under communist rule, stripped of estates and titles. Some worked as teachers or engineers, their aristocratic lineage reduced to a whispered memory at family gatherings. In Hungary, the Esterházy family, once among the most powerful in Europe, endured imprisonment and confiscation under the communists. Their castles became museums or government offices, while their descendants lived modestly in small apartments. The grandeur of centuries was erased, yet fragments of cultural heritage survived in music, libraries, and traditions passed down quietly. The human side of these stories lies in the small adjustments. A countess who learns to cook for her family for the first time, a duke who takes up farming on a small plot, a princess who works as a secretary. Each adaptation strips away layers of luxury, leaving behind something more ordinary, sometimes more authentic. For some, this was liberation, a chance to live without the burden of grandeur. For others, it was humiliation, a reminder of what had been lost. Life after luxury also carried psychological burdens. Children raised on stories of lost palaces and vanished estates often grew up caught between two worlds. They inherited titles but not wealth, memories but not mansions. Some embraced the romance of decline, writing memoirs filled with nostalgia. Others rejected it, choosing to live entirely as modern men and women, unburdened by ancestral illusions. The struggle between memory and reality became a central feature of their lives. Yet within these struggles, there are also stories of remarkable resilience. Consider the case of the Italian Borromeo family, who lost much of their wealth in the 19th century but managed to reinvent themselves in new ways, marrying into families that restored portions of their influence and investing wisely in what remained. Though diminished, they endured, proving that adaptation rather than grandeur was the key to survival. The fading legacy of aristocracy is visible in Europe today in the many great houses that stand as museums. Visitors walk through halls once filled with dukes and duchesses, guided by plaques and docents. The families who once lived there may still own the name, but they no longer own the grandeur. Their legacy is cultural, historical, even romantic, but not material. In some sense, this too is survival. The wealth is gone, but the memory has been preserved for the public. At the heart of these stories lies a paradox. The collapse of fortune often led to suffering and humiliation, yet it also revealed strengths that luxury had hidden. Stripped of servants and estates, some aristocrats discovered resilience they never knew they had. Others fell apart, unable to endure life without grandeur. The legacy of wealth, once measured in palaces and jewels, became measured instead in endurance, adaptation, and the ability to find meaning in ordinary struggles. The image of resilience stands beside the image of decline. For every Maria sewing dresses in Paris or Otto von Habsburg rebuilding a life in politics, there was another aristocrat drinking away despair in a cafe or clinging to empty titles in exile. The legacy of luxury could fade into dignity or dissolve into ruin. It all depended on the choices made after the collapse, when grandeur was no longer an option and survival was all that remained. The stories of decline, exile, and survival leave us not only with a sense of tragedy, but also with a set of lessons that are as relevant today as they were in the past. The grandeur of vanished fortunes may feel distant, as though the palaces and carriages belong to another world entirely, yet the patterns that led to their downfall are familiar. Greed, arrogance, short-sightedness, and the belief that wealth is permanent are not relics of history. They are present in every age. To study the collapse of dynasties is not simply to indulge in curiosity about the past, but to uncover warnings for the present and future. One lesson is the danger of assuming that wealth, once attained, will last forever. Families like the Medici, the Vanderbilts, and the Romanovs believed that their names alone were guarantees of stability. They thought their lands would always yield rents, their banks would always command trust, or their thrones would always remain secure. Yet history shows that permanence is an illusion. No matter how great a fortune appears, it requires careful management, adaptability, and humility to endure. In the modern world, this lesson applies not only to families of inherited wealth, but also to businesses and even nations. The collapse of corporations such as Enron or Lehman Brothers echoes the same truth. When arrogance replaces prudence, even empires of finance can disappear in an instant. Another lesson is the importance of diversification. Many of the fallen dynasties tied their wealth too tightly to one source. The rubber barons of Brazil depended on a single product, only to lose everything when rubber was cultivated elsewhere. The southern planters of America relied entirely on slavery, and when that system ended, their fortunes crumbled. Modern parallels are everywhere. Companies that fail to adapt to new technologies, or families who place all their resources into a single investment, risk repeating the same mistakes. Wealth endures not by clinging to one source, but by spreading across many and adjusting to change. Equally significant is the danger of extravagance without restraint. The gambling tables of Versailles and the horse races of Virginia were symbols of pride as much as entertainment, but they also consumed vast fortunes. The same can be seen today in lifestyles that outpace income, in celebrities or entrepreneurs who spend recklessly on private jets and mansions without securing their future. Luxury may impress for a time, but without discipline, it becomes the seed of ruin. The quiet endurance of families who preserve their fortunes through modesty and care stands in stark contrast to the ruin of those who mistook display for security. Revolutions and wars provide another layer of warning. While no individual can prevent the tides of history, the downfall of families such as the Romanovs or the Pahlavis reminds us of the importance of flexibility and foresight. Those who adapted quickly to new realities, whether by fleeing early, investing abroad, or building new careers, had a chance to preserve fragments of their legacy. Those who clung stubbornly to old structures were often swept away entirely. In our time, this lesson applies to businesses that fail to see change coming, or to individuals who resist shifting economic or political climates. Survival often belongs not to the most powerful, but to the most adaptable. One of the most poignant lessons is the value of resilience. Life after luxury shows us that dignity is not always tied to wealth. A duchess who learns to cook, a prince who works as a clerk, or a noble family that turns a castle into a museum all reveal that survival is possible even after ruin. The grandeur may fade, but the ability to rebuild, to find meaning in ordinary work, can carry a legacy forward in a different form. This lesson applies to everyone, for setbacks and losses are not confined to kings and queens. Resilience transforms loss into a new kind of inheritance, one measured not in jewels but in strength. Modern parallels are striking when we look at the great fortunes of the 20th and 21st centuries. Technology billionaires, oil magnates, and financial titans may appear untouchable, just as the aristocrats of the past once did. Yet the same patterns lurk in the background. Speculative bubbles can burst, industries can collapse, political winds can shift, and personal arrogance can blind even the cleverest minds. The stories of vanished riches remind us that wealth must be managed with humility, foresight, and care. Without these, no fortune is truly secure. We also see that legacy is more than money. The Habsburgs, stripped of their empire, still left behind a legacy of culture, architecture, and political ideas. The Romanovs, despite their violent end, continue to fascinate and inspire interest in Russian history. Even the Vanderbilts, though their fortune dwindled, left behind grand houses that now serve as public treasures. These remnants remind us that what survives longest is not always the gold or the land, but the cultural, intellectual, and human contributions that transcend wealth itself. In a world obsessed with financial success, this perspective is vital. Building a legacy that endures requires more than money. It requires creating something of value that can outlive fortune. The decline of aristocracy also teaches us about humility in the face of time. Generations of dukes and princes believed they would always hold power, yet their names faded into obscurity within decades. For modern families, businesses, and individuals, the reminder is simple: fortune is fleeting. The wise response is not despair but stewardship, to use wealth well while it lasts, to prepare for change, and to understand that influence must be renewed in every generation. There is also a lesson about pride. Many aristocrats clung to titles long after they had lost the means to support them, insisting on being addressed as counts or dukes while living in poverty. This pride, while understandable, often blinded them to opportunities for adaptation. Those who humbled themselves enough to take ordinary work or reinvent themselves often fared better. Today, too, pride can prevent people from accepting change, from downsizing, or from starting anew after failure. The lesson is clear: pride may preserve a title, but humility preserves a future. In reflecting on all these stories, from the Medici bankers to the Romanov emperors, from the Vanderbilt heirs to the Pahlavi exiles, what emerges is not simply a catalogue of ruin, but a mirror. We see in them our own temptations, our own risks, and our own opportunities for wisdom. Wealth, whether inherited or earned, carries both privilege and responsibility. The mistakes of the past remind us that without discipline, foresight, and adaptability, even the greatest riches can vanish. For those who hold wealth today, whether large or small, the lessons are practical. Do not tie your entire fortune to a single source. Do not assume that tomorrow will look like today. Do not spend beyond what can be sustained. Do not cling to pride when humility would open a new path. And most importantly, remember that legacy is more than money. What endures is the culture, the ideas, the generosity, and the resilience passed on to future generations. These lessons resonate not only for the wealthy, but for all of us. Every family has a legacy to protect, whether it is a business, a home, or simply the values we pass to our children. The ruins of palaces remind us that nothing material is indestructible. But the resilience of individuals who rebuilt after ruin shows us that strength, wisdom, and creativity can survive any collapse. Protecting your own legacy means thinking not only of wealth but of character, not only of possessions but of principles. As we close this exploration of vanished riches, the message is not one of despair but of awareness. The shocking downfalls of dynasties, the vices that corroded them, the revolutions that swept them away, and the resilience that followed all speak to the fragility of wealth and the endurance of the human spirit. They remind us that fortune can vanish, but lessons endure. If these stories have intrigued you, consider how they apply to your own life and legacy. What steps can you take to protect what matters most? How can you ensure that what you leave behind is not only wealth, but wisdom? These are questions worth asking, and the answers will shape the future as surely as the choices of past aristocrats shaped their decline. I would love to hear your thoughts on these histories, your reflections on the patterns of rise and fall, and your sense of what legacy truly means. Share your perspective, join the conversation, and if you have enjoyed this journey through the drama of vanished fortunes, subscribe for more stories that bring the past to life. History has no shortage of warnings and wonders, and together we can continue uncovering them, learning from the lost to protect what is yet to come.